Uh, did you ever regret that?
No, I didn't.
Were you just
Most people who watch the Waltons for 9 straight seasons will tell you the same thing without hesitating, that John and Olivia Walton felt like a real marriage, not a television one, and that something about the way those two people looked at each other went beyond anything a writer could put on a page? They were right. And for over 40 years, the woman at the center of that feeling, actress Michael Learned, never told a single soul why. When The Waltons premiered on CBS in September of 1972, the network held its breath. A quiet drama about a Depression-era family living in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia had no business competing with the louder, flashier programming that dominated early 70s television. Critics were skeptical, executives were cautious, and yet from the very first weeks on air, something happened that nobody had planned for. Viewers didn't just tune in, they came back every week and brought their families with them because the show gave them something television rarely delivers cleanly, the feeling of sitting inside a home that actually feels like one. At the heart of that feeling were two people, Michael Learned playing Olivia Walton, the mother, and Ralph Waite playing John Walton Sr., the father. And the warmth that poured off their scenes together was the kind that doesn't come from direction or clever writing alone. It came from somewhere else entirely, and the full truth of where it came from didn't surface until Ralph Waite was already gone. Both Michael Learned and Ralph Waite arrived on that set from the theater world, not from television. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. Stage actors are trained to find the truth inside a scene rather than perform on top of it. And when two people with that particular discipline end up across from each other under the same lights day after day, the connection that builds between them tends to run deeper and stranger than what typically develops on a film set. From the earliest days of shooting, something between Michael and Ralph settled into place with a naturalness that surprised even them. Their timing locked in without rehearsal. Their emotional responses to each other didn't need adjustment or direction, and Michael would describe it later, much later, as a pull she felt from the very beginning, a magnetic quality to their connection that never weakened across all 9 years of working together. Ralph Waite at that point had recently come through a divorce and was quietly fighting a serious battle with alcoholism. Two realities that placed him in a vulnerable and complicated space personally. Michael was married when the show began, though that marriage would eventually end during the show's run. Neither of them was in a position where pursuing something beyond a working friendship could have led anywhere stable or good. And whether they consciously named that reality or simply felt it between them without discussion, they drew a line early on and held it with a consistency that never wavered. No declarations were made, no dramatic conversations happened. The line simply existed, understood by both, protected by both, and never crossed across nearly a decade of side-by-side work that brought them as emotionally close as two people can get while technically keeping their distance. What makes that restraint so striking is what it produced in the work itself. The Waltons is remembered today as one of the most emotionally authentic family dramas in American television history, and a huge part of that authenticity lived specifically in the marriage between Olivia and John Walton. Audiences believed in that marriage the way they believe in very few things on screen, and the reason they believed in it is because the feeling underneath it was never entirely fictional. Every scene where John reached for Olivia's hand at the end of a hard day, every quiet moment where his eyes found hers across a crowded table, every goodbye that stretched a breath longer than the script technically required, those moments carried real weight because the feeling being channeled through them was borrowed from something genuine. Michael Learned and Ralph Waite were not manufacturing tenderness for the camera. They were allowing a carefully contained version of something true to pass through the work, and audiences felt it without ever knowing what they were actually feeling. The people who worked on the set across those 9 seasons noticed the chemistry consistently and remarked on it often, though nobody ever reached for the right word to describe what it actually was. Directors saw it. Producers saw it. The child actors who grew up on that show watched these two adults navigate their relationship with a steadiness and care that left an impression lasting decades. But the boundary Michael and Ralph maintained was so real and so consistently honored that it never gave anyone standing nearby a reason to look harder at what lay underneath it. They were not careless people. They understood exactly what they were protecting and exactly what breaking it would cost, not just in terms of professional consequences, but in terms of something far more personal, the friendship itself, the trust, the particular kind of closeness that had grown between them, and that neither was willing to sacrifice for something that circumstances would not have allowed to survive anyway. 9 seasons of television is a long run by any measure, and by the time the Waltons filmed its final episodes in 1981, Michael and Ralph had shared years of long shooting days, late nights on set, creative conversations that went far past what the scripts required, and an emotional intimacy that had deepened steadily without either of them ever giving it a name out loud. Leaving the show wasn't simply finishing a job. The world they had built together over nearly a decade was ending, and with it the only context in which their connection had ever been allowed to exist fully and without consequence. The goodbye was layered with things neither of them could articulate, because to articulate any of it would have meant acknowledging all of it, and that was something they still weren't ready to do. After the Waltons ended, both careers kept moving forward. Michael learned to return to stage work and took on a range of television roles that earned her continued respect across the industry. Ralph Waite went back to the theater, appeared in films, and years later introduced himself to a completely new generation of viewers through recurring work on NCIS, where his warmth and quiet authority translated just as powerfully as they always had. Their friendship survived the end of the show and continued in whatever form their separate lives allowed, and the closeness between them, though no longer anchored to a shared set and a shared daily rhythm, never fully dissolved, but the deeper layer of what existed between them stayed buried. Michael carried it without speaking about it for decades, protecting it with the same discipline she had always brought to keeping it contained. For a long time, the silence held for reasons beyond simple privacy. Speaking about it would have required sitting fully inside the grief of what it was, acknowledging not just the warmth of what she had felt, but the weight of what had never been said, the conversations that never happened, the words that stayed trapped somewhere between her throat and the air. Keeping it quiet meant she could hold it as something sacred and intact, untouched by the complications that naming it would have introduced. People of her generation understood that instinct better than most, the sense that some things remain whole precisely because they are kept away from the pressure of public acknowledgement. And Ralph was still alive. That mattered in ways she may not have fully understood until he wasn't. Ralph Waite passed away in February of 2014 at 85 years old, and the response from the entertainment world was genuine and warm. His legacy as an actor, as a man of integrity, and as the steady patriarch of one of television's most beloved families, drew tributes from across the industry and from fans who had never stopped caring about the world he helped create. For Michael, the loss registered on a level that went deeper than any of those tributes could reach. His death closed off something that had always remained theoretically open, however unrealistically, and that closing was permanent and final. Every unsaid word she had carried for 40 years suddenly sat heavier, not because she regretted the silence exactly, but because the silence had now become the only version of the story that would ever exist between them. In the time that followed, something in Michael shifted. The grief worked on her the way grief works on things that have been sealed for a long time, loosening what silence had compressed and making space for truth that had no more reason to wait. She began speaking about Ralph in ways she had never allowed herself to before, not in a dramatic fashion, not with the kind of confession designed to generate headlines, but with a measured and unhurried honesty that carried more weight for its quietness. She talked about the way he would take her hand during breaks in filming, gently and without explanation, as though the gesture simply felt right in that moment and needed no justification. She described the way he could sense when something was wrong with her before she said anything at all, and how he would offer steadiness without making her feel fragile for needing it. His attention, she said, was complete and entirely without performance, and for a woman of her depth and sensitivity, that quality of being truly seen by another person was not a minor thing. It was everything. And then she said the thing that stopped people. She said she believed he had loved her too, not as something she had constructed from a complicated friendship or read into moments that didn't carry what she thought they carried, but as a mutual truth that both of them understood clearly and both of them chose, by silent agreement, to protect rather than pursue. They were in love, she said, using those exact words without apology or hesitation, but they were not lovers. That distinction holds an entire world inside it, a world of restraint and quiet sacrifice and a particular kind of longing that never resolves and never fully leaves. People who have lived through something similar recognized it immediately when they heard her describe it. And the fans who had watched Michael Learned and Ralph Waite for 9 years, who had always felt that something beneath the surface of those performances ran deeper than television normally allows, heard her words and understood that what they had sensed all along had been real. Nothing about the show itself changed when Michael finally said these things. The episodes exist exactly as they always have, unchanged and permanent, every scene preserved exactly as it was filmed. But the way those scenes register now carries a different weight. Every lingering glance John Walton sent across the family dinner table, every moment where his hand found his wife's shoulder after a hard piece of news, every scene where the two of them simply existed in the same frame with a naturalness that felt lived in rather than performed, all of it now arrives with the understanding that the two people inside those moments were channeling something genuine. The love that audiences felt watching the Waltons television series was never entirely invented. It was being fed, carefully and consciously, from a source that existed just off-screen and that neither performer ever allowed to go further than the work. Michael Learned's story and the long silence she kept around it tells us something about a generation of performers who understood discretion as a form of integrity rather than concealment. She didn't stay quiet out of shame or fear. Protecting what existed between her and Ralph Waite meant keeping it away from the machinery of public consumption, away from the headlines and the interpretations and the reductions that come with exposure. What they had was sacred to her, and sacred things require a certain amount of distance from the world to stay that way. Her silence was its own kind of devotion, the choice to hold something precious rather than spend it for the sake of being understood. But grief eventually overrides even the most disciplined silence. Ralph Waite was gone, and with him any remaining possibility of a conversation that might have finally named what both of them had always known. That loss broke something open in Michael, not violently but gently, the way very old wood eventually gives under sustained weight. And what came out when she finally spoke wasn't drama or bitterness or the kind of retrospective longing that exists mainly for an audience. What came out was something quieter and more honest than that. We were in love. 4 words carrying 40 years of restraint inside them, delivered without decoration, and landing with a force that no grand confession could have matched. What Michael Learned and Ralph Waite built together across their years on the Waltons, both the visible work and the invisible thing running beneath it, belongs to a specific tradition in American television history that doesn't get discussed often enough. The show itself represented a vision of family life and human dignity that resonated with viewers across wildly different backgrounds because it refused to sentimentalize or oversimplify the people it depicted. Olivia and John Walton were not idealized figures. They were people who struggled and doubted and got tired and kept going anyway, and the actors who played them brought a lived-in truth to those qualities that came directly from who they were and what they genuinely felt for each other. The Waltons television series earned its place in cultural memory through exactly that kind of authenticity, and the emotional core of that authenticity had a name that nobody knew until Michael finally gave it one.